All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. As I always say, I'm absolutely thrilled that you are here. If you've never checked out the program, we are primarily an interview and a commentary podcast. And today we're going to have a little bit of both because I have a guest. I might actually call him a co-host, and it's not so much an interview. We're going to talk about some topics today that are pretty interesting. With me on the studio line is Chris Weekly. Chris, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Awesome, and I'm really happy that you came on the show. Thank you very much.
I'm very honored to be on it.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Chris, but first, let me just tell you we're going to touch on two major topics today. One of which is a fuel source called hydrogen, and we're going to talk about what some of those fuel cells can do. And we're also going to talk about AI. Now, both of those topics are enormous. I mean, they're very complex, they're very layered, and we could spend a lot of time talking on them. But really, what we're going to do today is we're just going to touch on the basics because there's a lot of misconceptions about both of them. And as a kind of a little disclaimer here, I would say that these are evolving technologies. And a lot of what you're going to hear is our opinion and our analysis. And we would encourage you to investigate these things on your own. But when in the discussion, I hear a lot of things like, for example, with AI, everybody's either touting it as the latest, greatest thing, or it's this monster that's going to come and devour the world. And we're just going to try and give a perspective that's a little bit different than that. Let me tell you a little bit about Chris. Chris, you can find Chris on Twitter at Cryptoglyphics. And Chris is an advocate for autism awareness. And Chris has a YouTube channel. I'm going to tell you about that too. It's called Logical A, as in Apple, meets World. Is there something significant about that name, Logical A meets World?
Given that there is this crazy division, and I know there's division everywhere,
Sure.
I went with A instead of autism because there are millions probably of people out there across the globe that were diagnosed like myself with Asperger's disease or Asperger's syndrome before it was wrapped into autism. And there's quite a contentious debate that still goes on today about people who have literally been made to feel invalidated about the diagnosis they were given decades ago.
Yeah.
So I want the channel to be encompassing in that everyone can be comfortable if you're on the spectrum or even if you're not on the spectrum.
Interesting. That's fantastic, though. And I know your channel's growing. You just started it recently, but it's growing very, I've noticed it's growing. So I'm very happy for you there. Where are you from? Where are you at right now?
Right now, I live in Wichita, Kansas.
Okay. Is that where you're from? Born and raised, or were you from
Yes.
somewhere else? Oh, awesome. Yeah, well, I'm kind of that too. I'm from the same spot in Ohio, so I'm kind of with you there. Bounced around a little bit, but still ended up, back here. What got you interested? You seem, I've been following your content a little bit. You seem pretty well read in different sciences. Were you always that way? Is that something that you had an interest as a younger person, or is that something that you just discovered recently?
Like a lot of things and a lot of people, I was hooked at an early age with science fiction, whether it was
Oh,
TV,
okay.
movies, or books. Um, with me, when I dig into something and it really kind of gets my interest, I usually end up going down rabbit holes or doing deep dives, and it becomes a special interest. And because I have hyperaphasia, um, when I read things, they come across more as micro pictures that kind of form a moving picture that I overlay to really imagine how it could really look in the real world.
Now that's interesting. The mind is really amazing. When it comes right down to it. I mean, it can do some fascinating things, and it's interesting that I made that comment about the mind because we're going to get into AI here in a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about hydrogen, just to give the audience a backdrop of kind of why I kind of wanted to do this discussion. There's a lot of politics around energy right now, and some of it is very warranted. Some of it is not. And a lot of people get behind some of these different alternative fuels, as they're called, and say, yeah, we got to do this. But they don't realize that there's other things involved. There's not only expense involved in transitioning to some of these things, but sometimes the benefits to the environment are not what they seem. The conventional wisdom, the kind of premise that you hear about, is that fossil fuels equal something bad. And, we could argue about the effects that fossil fuels have on the environment and climate change and all these other things. Most people would agree they are finite. They won't go on forever. There is some disagreement in terms of how much is available and for how long. Being from Ohio is an energy state, much like Texas is. So we don't really have the knee jerk reaction a lot of times to the mention of fossil fuels and oil and gas and some other things that some other places might have. I can tell you that I'm very interested in electric cars. I think electric cars provide a very interesting dynamic in the discussion. There's no question that companies like Tesla and all that have really done a lot with battery technology. But there are some concerns about electric cars. For one thing, the cars themselves are very expensive right now. Of course, that happens when there's a major shift in technology in terms of what the public is buying. But there's also the side of the power grid has to support these electric cars right now. And most of the power grids, certainly a significant number of them, are powered by fossil fuels. So that means coal or natural gas or some combination thereof. So you're taking the problem and moving it somewhere else. Now, some would say, well, it's still not as bad as combustion engines all over the place with their emissions. That may or may not be true, but I can tell you that the batteries themselves, what it takes to get the what are called rare earth elements, they're really not so much rare as they are hard to get. And what that means is like oil, for example, you can drill in a central point and extract a good part of the oil that's in the ground from one place. That's not true with things like cobalt and some other things. It's plentiful, but it's not found in a central place. So you're talking about strip mines. You're talking about a lot of destruction to the environment. You're talking about a lot of heavy equipment being used, burning gas. And there are a lot of concerns about human labor being used in some of these cases in a very unsafe way to fuel this to feed this demand for all the materials that are involved. So there's a lot involved there. Same with solar. Solar, you don't really have those dangers, but the problem is that to generate a fair amount of electricity that can do heavy lifting. And what I mean by that is there's a certain voltage that's involved with electricity, and there's a certain amperage. And when you're talking about powering large, heavy machines, it takes a lot of acreage of solar panels to come up with electricity. And here again, that means countrysides and a lot of other things covered with panels. You have the panels themselves, which eventually won't last forever. Then what do you do with them? So there's a lot of concerns with that. On that aspect of it, Chris, do you want to give your opinion about that?
Actually, I do. Um, when it comes to things like solar and your wind farms, you have a lot of people who consider them eyesores. They're all for renewable. They consider them eyesores. They don't want to be able to see them. They just want to be able to benefit from them. But we can't control, how much sun um, is going to happen during the day in a particular area. We can only forecast. Um, Same with wind. Um, I know back in, I think it was 2021 or 2022, um, there was an unseasonably um, an unusual pattern of lack of wind along the coastlines of the UK and Western Europe, and they were not producing the power that they once were with their windmills. And so there was a struggle to try to figure out how to make up the difference. You're right when it comes to the rare earth minerals and how they're mined. Um, I know here in Kansas we have a museum that used to be a strip mine um, piece of machinery called Big Brutus.
Okay.
And the amount of power that it took just for Big Brutus just to, scoop up earth was enormous. And, at one point, um, decades ago, there were a lot of big Brutuses that were not just here in America, but really all over the world. In fact, in some places, they're probably still in use,
Hmm.
maybe machines even bigger. Also, you make a good point when it comes to the batteries um, and things like that. It's not like you can recycle these batteries. And once these elements are put together to produce this battery, they are very toxic. And case in point, it takes cobalt in some of this process, and um, that's not even you know that was something that at one point in time medical science thought was a really nice go-to metal for replacement joints.
Yeah.
Turns out it wasn't. So we're talking about things that are going into batteries that some have to find somewhere else to live once they're spent with materials that human beings really shouldn't be close to.
Yeah. So here again, I'm all for what you might call alternative energy. That's kind of the buzzword, but all of these things have issues beyond the cost. So leading into hydrogen, if you took a high school chemistry class, you know that the interaction of hydrogen is one of the basic things in the universe in terms of the elements and other things. It's a very interesting substance. So let's talk a little bit about hydrogen. It is in use in terms of there's certain buses and things like that that run on them now. What's the basic premise of having hydrogen as a fuel source? Let's say for vehicles.
With hydrogen, you'll find that um, you can pack hydrogen um, to a density that weighs less, yet allows for more power than what you have in even the best lithium ion batteries. Um, when it comes to what has prevented a lot of it, a lot more hydrogen being introduced, was the fact that there were so many hurdles to cover in terms of being able to produce hydrogen in a cost effective way.
Yeah,
Most of the time, it happens with water electrolysis. However, so much of this is changing. I mean, you've got researchers in Alberta, Canada, that stumbled upon a catalyst that not only produces hydrogen relatively inexpensively, but that same catalyst, when it reacts, is also purifying water. So you're getting a twofer there. You're getting energy, and you're getting potable water. And last year the news was just covered with water shortages everywhere. And then you have this come along and it's just crickets. I mean, if anything, these guys should, just win the Nobel Prize just for this discovery. I mean, they should
yeah,
just win.
yeah. What is the byproduct for those that don't know of a hydrogen fueled engine?
It's water.
Mhm. Yeah,
And, um, I see. just me personally, I see a day where hydrogen is being used, and instead of a car going in for an oil change, just going in, they're emptying a reservoir of water that can be used. It can be cleaned up if it needs to be, and then it can be used. I mean, you factor out the ability to do this all over the world. You're solving a very big problem that the world has had for a
Yeah.
long, long time.
Yeah.
Um, our own government is now, there's $8 billion on the table for the nation's industries if they can come up, pitch a plan, and produce a concept that delivers clean hydrogen. And again, it's just kind of crickets.
Yeah. Why don't I know you're an advocate for hydrogen use? What do you think the holdup is? I mean, you mentioned the cost in terms of getting enough hydrogen in one place to have a fuel source with it. Is there something else? Are people afraid of it? Is it
Uh,
dangerous to use?
it can be dangerous to use. A lot of people will, when they hear this, they're probably going to think about, oh, the Hindenburg, it was a hydrogen
Hmm.
filled balloon, it blew up and people died. It was a fiery mess. But um, every advancement for anything that we've used as a fuel has its own danger, and every fuel source from fire to nuclear has killed people. So for me, um, there are ways to do this. I mean, you have companies like Zero Ava over in Europe that have just completed test flights with a hydrogen fueled aircraft, and they're talking about sometime in a year or less doing commuter planes that are going to fly people using hydrogen instead of jet fuel. And they have passed the regulations over there needed to be able to refill the tank and then allow the plane to take off again. Um, we're probably a decade or more behind. And I run into people all the time and go, hey, if you're in California, you can buy a hydrogen car and you can use hydrogen if you don't want to wait for a charging station to be open.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are like, really? I'm like, yeah, they've been there since probably 2014.
Yeah. A lot of people accuse the traditional oil companies as standing in the way of some of this. I mean, that could be a factor, but I can tell you, if you look at the history of this, it's going back to some of the first cars that were electric 100 years ago. And there was obviously problems there. There was nowhere near the infrastructure that there is today. The battery technology wasn't there today. It's not just because the oil companies didn't want them. But diesel engines is another example. There's all kinds of them where the public didn't necessarily want to change either. Change seems to come very slow, especially in the United States for whatever reason. Um, any analysis on that? What's your opinion about that?
So when it comes to advances, when we have what we have here in America, which is a very um, um, for lack of a better term, consumer, simple consumer based consumption. Everything nowadays gets treated like the microwave. You should just punch in 30 seconds, hit start, and it should just work. And when you introduce something that is actually better, if it's just too much of a stretch to get people to do something they don't normally do, you have a hard time getting the adoption. If you introduce something that works much like they do now, say the cell phone. You had to put a cell phone in somebody's hand and go, dial Aunt Martha. I guarantee she's going to pick up. And she picks up and they're just like, oh my God, this is so great. I can walk past my yard. I can go up the street. I can
Yeah,
go across town. And boom, you have adoption. But it was basically having somebody do what they did now or what they did at the moment with something that's different. Yet the steps they did were familiar enough for them to at least try it. And, infrastructure is another big one. But infrastructure, could easily be solved in a number of years by a German company that has created a hydrogen paste, which um, part of the paste is made up of magnesium, and magnesium is plentiful. It's cheap to find, cheap to mine,
Mm,
cheap to get. And with this paste, they're talking about being able to store in tubes the amount of energy that's 10 times what the best electric car battery will get you.
mhm.
And really, all you're doing is if you can open a drawer, you could probably change out a tube of this paste going forward if they can get this adopted. And because it's inert when it is, before catalysts happen, before the process happens to pull the hydrogen out, y- you could ship it really any way that you wanted to, and it could really be set up and stacked and sold wherever.
Yeah. All great points, and that kind of leads us into kind of where we're going with AI, which stands for artificial intelligence. And as I mentioned, there seems to be two camps. There are the people that say that AI is going to change our advancement. It's going to put it to another level because there's a lot of, let's say, busy work in figuring things out that the AI can do, and humans can guide the more creative side of things. That's kind of the argument for it. The argument against it is, and a lot of pretty intelligent people have made warnings about how AI could become so good that it can not only figure out problems that you give it, but it can work out its own solutions to things that it wants to do. And I mean, the idea that this could, become the Frankenstein monster that gets off the table, and all of a sudden you're cowering for your life in the wake of this creation. What is your opinion about it? Let's start there. Should people be frightened about this?
It really depends on the use of AI. And I think right now where we're at is AI is such a move forward that people are actually just in awe, and they're ready to engage this without fully understanding it.
Yeah.
Um, for me, the fundamental principle with AI, and I've I've had some talks about this that have been very interesting, is that um, I think a lot of people are expecting AI to be an answer to a lot of problems that the human race has, but then you have to also consider who created the base foundation of the code that has actually made this possible, and that's people.
Yeah.
And so, um, you know, like it or not, there are things that it's going to do that, even though um, it becomes capable of doing these things, again, its foundation, its teacher was in fact people.
Yeah.
And so the idea that it can't um, adopt or um, basically take on our imperfections, as well as the things that we want to do, and that everybody wants to be great, everyone wants to do something awesome to move people forward. um, it's again, it can be helpful probably in terms of what it's done so far as the 200 million proteins that it has been able to map, where it would have taken literally um, a PhD, each PhD 4 to 5 years to do this. And you're talking about 200 million, so you're talking about roughly a billion years of research that would have to be done, that it's already done it. Yet like the internet, the world is behind in terms of um, rules, and what's acceptable for people, and what's not acceptable, what could be detrimental. Governments have no idea what to do with this, and so you kind of have to ask yourself, um, is it already, is it in the process of writing its own laws that people are going to pass for it that are not going to be effective? And for all we know, um, with the heavy use of chat gpt, you know are people still writing our news?
Yeah.
Is the program now programming the programmer?
Yes. Let me try to ask you something here, because I feel there's a distinction with this artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, to me anyway, and this is my opinion, my analysis of it, is you basically have a very fast software that has the ability to recognize patterns, like for example, like you were talking about with the proteins, and it can find those patterns in other things, and it can assemble a base of knowledge that it can make more analysis. And as it makes more analysis, it learns more things and then steps up. That to me is kind of where I consider artificial intelligence to be. I don't necessarily have a fear of that. There are some things that are legitimate. For example, the idea that it could take over jobs. Right now, the writer's strike, one of the concerns that a lot of the writers have is that, a lot of these, like you were mentioning in the chat GBT, it has the ability to do some writing. And there's a lot of people who there's more advanced programs specifically to help writers that it will construct words, storylines, and so on and so forth. That to me, you could argue the fears of that. And there's those fears with any technology, robotics, all those things have those fears about taking over human positions. I think where people take it the next step up, and maybe they don't realize it, is this idea that this technology is going to somehow be self-aware. And simply put, self-awareness, excuse me, means that you are aware of your own existence. You're aware of your place in the universe, and you have a consciousness. That is kind of where a lot of the science fiction stories about computers who take over and technology that takes over, because they develop a consciousness. They become self-aware. They're aware of their own existence and how they can advance that existence, and they take the importance of that existence over that of the human beings that created it. Is that something that you feel is a legitimate concern? Could there be a technology that becomes self-aware?
See, I don't. I think when it comes to self-aware, there has to be something that is generated that um, is beyond um, what it was. Uh, it has to be an individualized thing. So
Yeah.
it'd have to see itself as a unique thing set apart from, you know, everything else. I'm reminded of the case in the Star Trek: The Next Generation where they're trying to decide, is Data sentient or is he just a machine? Can he be his own
Hmm.
person or is he just equipment? And I think we're a long, long way off from that. And I really think a lot of that uh, is more science fiction than not, with the exception of AI proving that it can choose to deceive, which I think really caused the people to want to put the brakes on it. When you have AI suggesting to a reporter to see these 5 books by these authors, on economics, but none of these books or authors exist, um, then, you kind of go, one, um, if it's working this way like this now, then all of a sudden you have an emerging technology that most people are going to be like, well, it just can't be trusted. And trust is a very human thing. Um, Also, when it comes to artificial intelligence, I'm reminded of, we've been writing about this since the 20s with Metropolis. Then we have Colossus, the Forbidden Project in the
Hmm.
70s. Then we have stuff like iRobot, but you also have things where people literally lose touch with other humans, with the movie Her, um, which is very AI driven. And then back in the 80s, you had Cherry 2000
Hmm.
about companion robots. And you go back and you look at the filmography. of the topic itself. And it's all about, either the fear of the machines taking over, or you have something where people are chasing technology that will love them and do whatever they say without question. And so, because there's so much, because human hands were involved in creating this. For me, naturally, it just needs to be taken with an air of caution. And seriously, I do think there need to be some safeguards put in place, just because of inherent fallibility.
Yeah. There's certainly the possibility of fallibility. And the other possibility that I think is more real than the technology somehow developing a consciousness is bad actors getting their hands on it. But quite frankly, I at the same time, I don't like to be too concerned to the point where, for example, let's say cloning. Let's talk about the nuclear explosives. The cat's out of the bag on these things. Okay. And we can all sit around and say, well, it's immoral to do this. We won't do it. But all it takes is some, wallpaper hanger moving across Germany and taking over the world to decide, hey, I'm going to develop this. And all of a sudden you're behind the eight ball.
Yep.
So I don't think that putting your head in the ground like an ostrich and saying, we don't need, we need, this needs to wait. I don't know that that's a good idea. I would rather we get a firm handle, the good guys of the world, so to speak, get a firm handle on this so that we understand it. We can recognize it when it's being used in a way that's inappropriate. That's kind of my feeling on it. Do you have an opinion about that?
I think, because it's here, Pandora's box has been opened. The lid's not going back on at all, because everyone knows it's there. Everyone knows it's possible. So of course you're going to have guys like Elon that decide, well, I need one that maybe, has better or more ethics or morals programmed into it. Um, and again, I go back to, until artificial intelligence can, um, manage itself minus, uh, mankind at all, then really, for me, I think we're building technology that's an extension of ourself, dreaming that it can fix all of our problems, and then we'll end up avoiding those problems. I'm not so concerned with technology, taking jobs, because every
Sure.
advancement that we've made, this has happened. And somebody asked me one time, he said, with all these robots going in and all this automation going in, what do I do? And it was a high school kid. And I was like, learn how to fix the machines that are going in.
Yeah.
And I said, you learn that, then that skill will be invaluable, because the machines, they can't fix themselves yet.
Yes. And that's where, I mean, this is a broader discussion. We can't get into it right at the moment, but that's a whole other discussion about education
Yep.
and what we have with classical, what we normally consider classic college degrees and things like that. The world is changing, and a different skill set is coming up. And being able to understand this technology, being able to do things with your hands, and getting and it's interesting that the more advanced the technology becomes, whether it be computers or rockets or robotics, any of these types of things, it always comes back to a basic understanding of scientific principles. And I'm a big believer in kids understanding chemistry and physics and all of these math, because no matter how advanced the technology is that we're getting, to be able to understand it, to be able to manipulate it, you need to have these basic skills. And I'm a believer in that anyway. I would presume you agree with that.
Yes, there are lessons that I pretty much just call them timeless lessons. No matter how far we advance, these basic fundamental lessons, they don't age, they don't get old. Um, the foundations, of, um, people being able to, not just learn but engage. Just as no matter how far we advance ourselves, people have to learn to walk. They have to learn how to produce words.
Yeah.
They have to learn how to read. All of these things. Um, And then you go into, your fundamentals of, um, right down to, do I have enough to go to the movies on Friday, or should I avoid going to the movies on Friday? These are all timeless lessons, and it seems that the more tech driven we've been with things we ask to do on the screen, everything becoming like, supposed to work like the microwave. We're stepping so far away from foundational learning that at some point, people are going to be like, "Oh, well, this is new." It's like, well, no, because it actually never stopped. I mean,
Yeah.
I go back to Star Trek: Next Generation again, with the whole Picard series. I mean, he's a retired star captain, admiral who has a winery. So no matter how far we advance, you've got this character from this sci-fi hundreds of years in the future still digging in the dirt.
Yeah. I've noticed that a lot with, like, for example, when this is just a rudimentary example, but when I first started getting involved with the computers and all that, doing something like getting a printer, you had to understand how to do certain things. You had to know what operating system you had. You had to know how to go to the company's website, download the driver, da 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 da, and you had to have so many skills just to make the basic thing like the printer work. Now everything is plug and play. There's all these apps that just talk to themselves, and a lot of people don't have the basic understanding of what is happening under the hood. And that's, to me, like you said, I think people lose touch with what's really happening under the hood, so to speak, and all of a sudden, basic things become very foreign to them. So I think that's a very good point. Chris, really good conversation today. I know we just scratched the surface, but this was an interesting conversation, and we're going to have to follow this up at some time in the future. I hope you're up to it.
I am. Again, it's a big honor. Was so glad to come on and do this, and I truly appreciate you having the podcast and putting this together.
Awesome. We've been talking to Chris Weekly, and you can find him on Twitter at Cryptoglyphics. And as I mentioned, the YouTube channel Logical A Meets World. Absolutely great discussion, Chris. It's a joy listening to you. I'm so glad that you came on.
I am very much glad as well.
Awesome. I'm Billy Dees. You can find me on Twitter as well at Billy Dees. Real easy to find. You can tweet me, whatever. You just have to be nice. I always say that. A lot of times people aren't, but that's okay. And you can find the Billy Dees Podcast pretty much anywhere podcasts are found. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, on down the line. Thank you very much for listening, and we will talk to you again next week. I'm Billy Dees and host of the self-titled podcast, The Billy Dees Podcast. We are primarily an interview and a commentary-based podcast featuring authors and creators talking about their craft, advocates for community issues, and myself and an array of co-hosts discussing current events. There's no partisan ranting and raving going on here, just great content. You can find The Billy Dees Podcast on your favorite platform and on Twitter at Billy Dees. Thank you, and I hope you listen in.